If you're voting for Donald Trump because you think that that's somehow going to save the Supreme Court, well, you're fooling yourself, because Donald Trump will absolutely torch it as bad or worse than Hillary Clinton ever will. It falls to Shikha Delmia at Reason.com today to deliver the latest reality check to Trumplicans, which of course they'll never cash. Now, many conservatives and libertarians are foolishly flirting with voting for Donald Trump because they fear ceding control of the Supreme Court to liberals. They reckon that Hillary Clinton's judicial appointments are guaranteed to be awful, and that's a pretty sound reckoning. Trump, on the other hand, despite all his flaws, has no reason to oppose originalist jurists committed to protecting limited government and constitutional checks and balances, they've deluded themselves into believing. And if it were any other candidate, or rather, if it were any actual Republican candidate heading up the Republican ticket, this would be a reasonable argument. But this is Donald J. Trump we're talking about, the New York liberal Democrat con man. Now, there is no doubt that Trump's list, his phony baloney plastic banana good time rock and roll list of potential justices, shrewdly released to fool conservatives jittery over his many heterodoxies, is a good one. It includes judges such as the Seventh Circuit's Diane Sykes, who wrote a stellar opinion defending the First Amendment right of Americans to record police officers in public, and the Tenth Circuit's Neil Gorsuch, or Gorsuch, whichever, who attacked judicial deference to unconstitutional executive edicts. My personal favorite, for sentimental reasons, is Michigan Supreme Court Justice Robert Young, who married the aforementioned Mrs. Delmia and her husband, and authored a fantastic opinion overturning the notorious Poletown ruling that permitted Detroit authorities to use the city's eminent domain powers to bulldoze a flourishing neighborhood to make room for a GM factory. Still, it would be a mistake to put too much stock in Trump's list, and not only because he is an ignoramus who still thinks judges sign bills, or because his word is worth less than his bankrupt Atlantic City casinos, or because his temperamental and character flaws are too great to be offset by a good court. It is because a Trumpetancy will have a transformative effect on the GOP itself. What have I been telling you people repeatedly over and over and over again on this channel? Which is the more dangerous? The enemy outside the gate, whom you know is the enemy and can fight before they make their way inside? Or the enemy who's already within, who is pretending to be one of us, but is actually undermining us and setting us up to be overrun by the enemy outside the gate? Or even worse, turning us into them. Indeed, by the time Trump is done, the GOP would have little use for originalism or limited government. Whatever the external threat of a Clinton presidency represents to these ideas, the internal threat that Trump poses is far greater. Annihilation versus assimilation. I would rather be annihilated than assimilated, wouldn't you? Trumplicans already have been. It's unclear how many justices the next president will appoint, but if Mrs. Clinton only fills the late Justice Antonin Scalia's vacant seat, she'll tip the Supreme Court in a liberal direction. that still does not justify the apocalyptic tone that some cuck-servatives strike, notes Ian Tuttle of National Review. That's because, setting aside the high-profile cases that both sides use to rally their base, on a day-to-day basis, partisan disagreements don't affect the court all that much. Tuttle notes that between January of 2012 and June of 2014, the Supreme Court ruled against the Obama regime unanimously 13 times on everything from recess appointments to abortion clinic buffer zones. Nor was this an anomaly. Since 1995, more than 40% of cases were settled unanimously by the court. Despite their ideological disagreements, justices are far more united than divided on the law. Which is to say, they're all wrong in their focus on case law as opposed and elevating that over the authority of the Constitution itself. And presidents, by and large, have respected the independence of the judiciary and left the court alone to settle cases as it sees fit, which is not necessarily a good thing, with some notorious exceptions like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who famously threatened to force justices who struck down the New Deal into retirement and packed the court with more pliant ones. Trump would be FDR on steroids. He savaged federal judge Gonzalo Curiel's Mexican heritage because the judge didn't dismiss the case against Trump University. In other words, do what I want, follow my orders, the law be cucked. If something as low stakes as this can set Trump off, imagine what he'd do if the Supreme Court took up a challenge to a signature issue of his presidency. A trumpetancy would be a rolling wave of one manufactured constitutional crisis after another. Constant, endless drama. Haven't we had enough of that bullshit over the past 8 years? Constant, endless drama, threats, biggest celebrity in the world. No more! Miria! Enough! No mas! Apparently I'm in the minority on that. That's all right. I'm used to being in the minority. That, however, is not likely to be Donald Trump, wouldn't be Donald Trump's worst damage. He's not going to win, but if he were, we're looking at the alternate reality here. To the extent that Trump has a vision for the GOP, it is along the lines of European-style workers' parties, his term, such as France's National Front. In other words, fascist/national socialist. This is an authoritarian, nationalistic, left-wing party whose main goal is to aggressively realign the economy around the interest of domestic workers by fanning the fires of xenophobia and protectionism. Autarky. Is this starting to sound... No shit. Is this starting to sound like fascist Italy and Nazi Germany yet? Because it's certainly looking that way. Maybe minus the concentration camps and the ovens, but otherwise. George Mason University's Ilya Somin points out that such a party would have no use for federalism, no use for the separation of powers, no use for individual rights, no use for the United States Constitution, Doug. To the contrary, such commitments would be an impediment to Trump's goals. Doug. It's unclear what the full contours of Trump's judicial philosophy would be, Somin notes, but they are likely, or would likely include sweeping executive powers. I thought that was bad. Or is it only bad when Barack Obama does it because he has a D after his name, but if Donald Trump does it with an R after his name, that's just fine? Principles, ex-Tea Partiers, principles? You're talking principles? A narrow view of freedom of speech. In other words, yeah, the left is trying to shut us up, but we're going to shut them up instead. First Amendment? A country where error is free to be opposed by words, I forget the exact Jefferson quote. Error is tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. And tight restrictions on civil liberties. Yeah, I thought that, oh, yeah, Obama's cracking down, and he is. He's cracking down on us? No, we're going to crack down on them. Thus has conservative principle and the United States Constitution been exchanged for simple tribalistic revenge. Tyranny for the right side. Being a slave on the winning side. If Trump succeeded in remaking the GOP in accordance with that vision, the party's judicial philosophy would change accordingly. The Constitution may not be a living document, but it also is not writ carved in stone. It is a malleable text through the Article 5 amendment process, which is always open to interpretation. Shouldn't be, but it is. There is nothing in it that says originalism is the correct approach. I guess the Founding Fathers didn't think it was necessary to say that which was supposed to be obvious. That's why you always spell it out. That's why they wrote the first 10 amendments, because they weren't sure that the message had gotten through. Enumerating limited powers wasn't enough. They had to write the first 10 amendments in order to specify, okay, this is what the federal government cannot do. And this is what the states cannot do, and so on and so forth. So don't expect a Trump GOP to die on the cross of originalism. Far more likely, says Somin, is that it would embrace judicial deference, or the view that the proper function of courts is to defer to the political branches, not necessarily keep each branch within constitutional limits, which actually is originalist. There's nothing in the Constitution, in Article 3, that gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. That's supposed to be the job of all the branches, all of us. Well, that would be much more convenient for the GOP's new agenda, and there are plenty of judges who are inclined to this view already, he says. And the transformed GOP is likely, fundamentally transformed GOP, would be likely to elevate them and marginalize originalists in the age of Trump. I mean, the bottom line is voting for Trump out of concern for the Supreme Court and originalism then is like handing the keys of your church to an arsonist clutching a can of gasoline in one hand and matches in the other, and hoping that somehow he'll spare the inner sanctum and the holy book. He won't. The tragedy is that by the time Trump burned it all down, the GOP would be well past the point of caring. But then, isn't it well past the point of caring already?